Apparently, at the end of this Jennifer Burns interview, unrelated, he reflects on his interview with Volodymyr Zelensky for quite a bit. And it's gotten quite a negative reaction due to, well, especially one statement where he kind of almost lectures Zelensky for not taking the opportunity on his podcast to push for peace. And I wanted to talk about it. And I only saw the clip of the lecturing, so I wanted to see his section from the podcast in its entirety so I could grade it as fairly as possible. So Lex Fridman did an interview with Volodymyr Zelensky, and I thought the interview was fairly good. I thought that, Volodymyr Zelensky did a good showing for the righteousness of his cause, was able to explain his country's position, was able to explain his historical position. And if you look at the comments in the video, while you're going to see comments all over the place, there did seem to be a general trend of people generally understanding Ukraine's position better and coming away with a more positive interpretation of the president's position. And I think that was the purpose Zelensky did the interview for. I think Zelensky did the interview because he wants to talk to the American people and make sure that support for Ukraine holds. Now, the reason Lex did the interview, I imagine, is not only because he wants to get information out of the interview like he does with all interviews, but also, and he makes this very open during his proclamations around it, is that he wants to use it as kind of like a platform for peace, that he talks to Zelensky, talks to him about peace, talks to Putin, talks to him about peace, then Zelensky throws some terms out, Putin throws some terms out, and then they can have, like, maybe Trump, who would be listening to the podcast, would listen to their terms, find some middle ground. Maybe Lex could be there so he can get autographs from everyone involved, and then you have peace, and then therefore Lex's interview podcast could act as a peace envoy of sorts. But that's not how it worked, because anytime that Lex would offer up a framework, Zelensky would reject the framework. For example, he's like, how do you find a middle ground with the Russian position? And then he's like, well, You're asking us to find a middle ground with an unjust position. And we need to talk about like the long-term consequences for the country and yada, 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 yada. And it's not just as simple as finding a middle ground between having 20% of your country occupied and terms forced upon you and freedom. And then at the end of it, he was at Zelensky's, spiel, which I would recommend you go listen to yourselves. I think he said it much better than I could ever re-articulate. And then at the end of this long, articulated, good, I think, repositioning of the conversation to understand the Ukrainian perspective, Fridman responded like, I understand that, but also for peace, what type of middle ground would you accept? And he wouldn't accept the reframing. He wouldn't use that Ukrainian perspective to use as a launching pad to dig deeper into that hole. He had this peace envoy framework, and he did everything he could to shove a square peg into a circle hole. Now, the interview, I think, ended up being good despite that fact, broadly speaking, even if there was a few questions about like forgiveness for Putin and such that I did not think were quaint. I think despite this fact, it ended up doing okay. But it is this area of peace envoy that pushes us once again to listen to Lex Fridman as he reflects on his interview with Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's listen a little bit to what Lex has to say. And figure out why Ukrainians are so angry at him right now.
Please allow me to say a few words about my interview with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now that a few days have passed and I've had the chance to think about the conversation itself, the response, future upcoming conversations, and what it all means for the war in Ukraine, for global geopolitics, and for us humans in general. I've gotten a lot of heartfelt, positive words from all sides, including, at least so far, literally everybody who knows me personally inside Ukraine, which includes a lot of soldiers and many high-profile figures, some who are supportive of the president and some who are critical of him. Literally all private communication has been positive and supportive. This is usually not the case with me. Friends usually will write to me to criticize and to disagree. That's the whole point of friendship. To argue and have fun doing it. There was none of that here, at least so far. So, thank you for your support and kind words. It means the world. The most common message was, please keep pushing for peace. I will. But online, on the interwebs, I saw a lot of attacks, sometimes from swarms of online accounts, which of course makes me suspicious about the origin of those attacks. One of my friends in Ukraine, who, by the way, thinks the attacks are all propped up by Ukrainian bot farms, said there's no need to say anything extra. Let the interview stand on its own.
Yes, I agree with that. Look, it's, of course, I want peace. Everybody wants peace on the ground, etc. I want peace. I just don't think that Lex Fridman's podcast is going to be the mechanism by which it was done. And so when you were like, okay, give me your middle ground between your position and their position, he's like, well, you need to understand that just, it wasn't as simple as like, okay, they want 20% of our land. How about they can keep, Mariupol and this and this and that, but, you can keep everything they occupy, but well, please let us secure here. So it's not as simple as that for the Ukrainians. And plus the people would not let them accept that. Even the Ukrainians in Ukraine, probably many of the ones that he's talking about privately express their interest in peace. If you'd say, okay, interest in peace under the circumstances, understanding that everything that they currently hold on to, the Russians are going to be able to keep. And if we were to accept the Russian terms, that would also mean no NATO membership that could dissuade a future invasion or alliance structure that could do so, meaning that the threat of invasion. So a lot of them might not accept the terms that might end up being the only ones that the Russians could accept right now, without some other form of pressure making people accept terms they otherwise would not have. For example, economic pressure, the threat of future aid. So that's why I just don't think Lex Fridman's going to do it, because I don't think he has the tools at his disposal to make aid happen. I think an American president, to make a peace happen, I think an American president threatening an increased aid, increased sanction pressure with the slow burn economic problems that Russia has that only continue to get worse, especially as they continue to cannibalize the commercial banking system, which we've seen a lot of reporting on recently, to stack on top of the 8% public spending that they publicly announced. So, it's not that I don't want peace. It's just I just don't think Lex Fridman's podcast is going to be the one to do it. You can talk about what type of deal could you accept? These are questions you could ask. But this idea of getting him into a corner to get him to forgive Putin, or to be fine, you know what, we'll give up this land or give up that land. It's just not going to happen. And the chance of it happening, period, is already difficult. But it's certainly, I just don't think it's going to happen in this environment. It's just, as debates are really happening internally about the actual terms that are going to be set, Zelensky's not going to give up anything on the podcast.
Just keep focused on the mission of pushing for peace. Basically, he's a Ukrainian version of my other friend, Joe Rogan, who to this day says, don't read the comments. This is generally good advice, and I try to follow it. But I'm also a human being. I wear my heart on my sleeve, and this interview, this war, for me, is deeply personal. And the level of vitriol, misrepresentation, and lies about the conversation and about me personally was particularly intense and disingenuous. So I thought I would use this opportunity to say a few words, just speak a bit more.
Is there any other critiques about some of the sillier questions, like the one about forgiveness and stuff like that for Putin, and like is any of it weighted? I doubt.
About how I approached this conversation with President Zelensky and conversations in general. This interview is something I poured my heart and soul into, preparing a lot. I've described parts of the preparation process I follow in the outro to the Zelensky conversation. But in general, let me say that I've read a lot, listened to a lot, and had a lot of private conversations with people on the ground. I have many flaws, but being unprepared for this conversation is not one of them. 2 low-effort attacks got to me a bit, if I'm being honest, though I am learning to take it all in stride. First attack is that I'm unprepared, uninformed, or naive. I don't give a damn about the trolls, but I want people who listen to me, who support me, who care about my words to know that this is not the case. It never will be the case for future conversations, especially ones of this importance. I work extremely hard to prepare. Second low effort attack that got to me.
So let me just throw this out there. Lex is naive. Now, that doesn't mean somebody can't be naive and still can't do a good job interviewing somebody. But I think his perception that his podcast could have been a bridgeway to peace is a naive perspective to have about what exactly your podcast can inform people. You can get like a good answer about how negotiations are going, or about the chances of where diplomacy could head forward from here, what the Ukrainian perspective is. The idea that your podcast was going to be used as a potential bridgeway for me, that is kind of naive, considering the state of the war, considering where each side has their current position, their negotiating position, considering Donald Trump's own ever moderating position on peace right around the corner from 24 hours to, well, I mean, again, if Trump's promise was to be fulfilled, the war would be over in the next 13 hours. In the next 13 hours. So I do think that can be naive. And I also found some of the questions naive. And even if they weren't naive, you could say, like, well, some people ask a question, even if it's not a question they really would normally ask, but to give the audience a perspective because they have an idea of what the response could be. And you could say that, but what I'm thinking about is that question where he's like, Putin loves his country. And then Zelensky's like, loves his country, but he sends his young men off to die for this idea of a dead empire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then he responds like, yeah, no, but he does love his country. He didn't really engage with Zelensky's point at all. And in this moments like that, where it feels like a certain naivete kind of comes out of him, imagining that all peoples or all leaders really value the same things, or that we all define love of country in the same way, which we don't necessarily do. Because I think Putin's love of country and my love of country would be very different.
A bit is that I'm a shill for Zelensky or a shill for Putin. Both accusations were hurled readily and freely by the online mob of all persuasions, by the left and the right in the United States and Europe, by the pro and the anti-Zelensky people in Ukraine or of Ukrainian origins, and by the pro and anti-Putin people in Russia or of Russian origins. As I've said over and over, this is not the case and will never be the case. I'm a shill for no one. More than that, I just simply refuse to be caught in any one single echo chamber. It's an ongoing battle, of course, because social media algorithms and the various dogmatic groups and tribes out there want to pull you in to their warm embrace of belonging, and humans want to belong. But the cost of the path I have chosen is that I will never belong to any one group. In the end, like many of us must, I walk alone. And I try to do my best.
Sorry, I did not time that. I swear to God. I swear to God. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, that's beautiful.
Best to do what is right to my independent heart and mind.
Somebody clip that. Somebody clip that.
Not what is popular with any one group. My goals for this conversation were twofold. First, give a large platform to President Zelensky to explain his perspective on the war, and to do so in a way that brings out the best in who he is as a leader and human being. Second goal was to...
That first goal, by the way, spot on. Good goal.
Push for peace, and to give him every opportunity.
And of course, wanting peace or like asking what pathways there are to peace, that's good. Thinking that you will be the one to initiate it by question and therefore trying to shove a square in a circle hole, not so much.
Second goal was to push for peace and to give him every opportunity possible to signal that he's ready to make peace and to provide his vision for what that might look like. And just to be clear, by peace, I mean long-lasting peace that minimizes suffering of people in the region and maximizes the flourishing of humanity.
By the way, he did offer that framework. It was just the Ukrainian framework, which is Russia leaves Ukraine. Ukraine joins the security arrangement so they can't be invaded again. And then, Ukraine will leave Kursk, I imagine. But like that was his framework. It's just the absolute opposite position of the Russians, which is why he followed up with what's your middle position. And then Zelensky said that answer that was not satisfactory towards you being the one to launch what that middle ground position would end up actually being, or what the negotiating position, which is never necessarily a middle ground, or not necessarily a middle ground position. If you have more leverage, it tends not to be one, which is why the Ukrainians want more leverage so they can get more negotiations, which is why they were not going to concede to I'm going to concede everything to the middle ground right away before Putin's even spoken on the show, so he can even take more, because he knows that this is our base ground. This is what we're already willing to give up. This was not practical. This is not practical for the exact goal he's aiming for.
In the coming decades, the war in Ukraine has led to over 1 million casualties and growing every single day. For some people, torn apart by loss, tormented and forced into a state of anger and hate, peace is a dirty word. To them, nothing less than justice must be accepted. I hear this pain. I've seen the bodies and the suffering. It's true. Peace will not bring back your loved ones.
By the way, justice is not just about, hatred has twisted my heart, and so I want to take all the bad Russians and, I'm going to get them in under. No. When I think of justice, my first thing isn't revenge or putting the Russians on trial. This feels like such an unlikely scenario that I don't even really consider the idea of the Putin actually puts the war criminals that committed Bucha on trial. No, it would have to be done the way the Mossad did it. To be blunt and honest with you guys, at least as long as the current government in Moscow holds. I think when people think about justice, it's the justice of being able to return to their homes, the justice of being able to freely voice opposition and have a civil society, being able to freely congregate their faith. For example, for all the 40 evangelical churches existed in Mariupol before the Russians took over. Now there's 0. Why? Because they shut them down because there wasn't with the Russian Orthodox pro-war church. That's not justice. When people talk about justice, that's what they could mean. Not just, I think the Russians are stinky. And I'm not trying to say that's all. I assume that when people hear justice, he doesn't think just that. But when people speak of justice, it's not just as simple as my heart has been twisted by hatred. It is they love their home, they love their church, they love their congregation, they love freedom of expression, they love freedom of the press, they love being able to do what you do freely in the West. And so that, for them, retaining that, gaining that back, on top of the lesson that is sent to the people who would do the injustice of invasion and conquest, that's the type of thing I think of when I think of justice, not just this idea of, getting them and, I don't like them, and so we have to show them.
But it will prevent further slaughter of more people, each of whom are someone else's loved ones. So again, the second goal of this conversation was to push for this kind of peace. So how did I approach it? Every conversation is its own puzzle, so let me try to explain my approach for this one. As I've said, I read and listened to a lot of material since February 24th, 2022. There would be many weeks over the past 3 years where I would spend every day over 8 hours a day of focused reading and research. There were several rabbit holes that I consistently returned to and researched, but the most important line of inquiry was always peace talks, not just in this war, but in other wars in modern history. For this specific war, as part of the background prep, I would take notes on every single perspective I could find on every single major diplomatic meeting and negotiation that happened in Ukraine-Russia relations since 1991. There is a lot of material to go through, and there are a lot of perspectives, even on the very 2019 meeting that President Zelensky spoke about in this podcast. Just as a small but important example, Andrei Bogdan was interviewed twice by Dmitry Gordon and gave a deep inside look of the administration of President Zelensky, including that very 2019 meeting. The two interviews are 7.5 hours, by the way, and from my interviewer perspective, are a masterclass of interviewing. Andrei Bogdan worked directly with President Zelensky as the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. He was there for the 2019 face-to-face meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin at the Paris summit, along with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel. This was part of the Normandy format peace talks. In those two interviews, Andrei Bogdan gave a very different perspective on that 2019 meeting than did President Zelensky to me in our conversation. The perspective being that the failure to negotiate a ceasefire and peace was not a simple one-sided story. I don't think this is the right time for me to dive into that data point.
Well then, okay, then why bring it up? I thought, okay, let's hear why it's not one-sided. Oh, well, it's not one-sided, but we'll just not reflect on it. You can go watch the whole 3.5-hour interview if you want, which I will not do. I already watched the Zelensky one.
And be critical. I'm not interested in being critical for the sake of criticism. I am interested, once again, in productive conversations, critical or otherwise, that push towards peace.
Like the Russians invade illegally in 2014. They take over Crimea. They then put troops, mercenaries, and resources into the Donbass. And when their whole project threatens to fall apart because the Ukrainians didn't want the Donbass to be in a state of rebel civil war and wanted to reunite the country, and so they did a military operation to do so, they put troops directly in to stop it. Because they wanted to take this land, interfere in it, and then eventually extend it deeper and deeper into Ukraine, which they did with the 2022 invasion. Like, at what point are we like, well, it's not as, the breakdown in negotiations isn't as one-sided as you think. What is the demands that the Russians made that were so not unreasonable that the Ukrainians couldn't concede to? Is it, for me, it's not that you can't find any individual instance of diplomatic malpractice. It's these general narrative, the general storyline, the one movement from one movement to one movement of who was pushing forward after what Ukraine gave up when it comes to inside of Ukraine. It's absurd to say the general situation was two-sided. You might say in one specific negotiation, it's more complicated, but just to drop that to an audience and to not give any more detail, I don't know.
Peace. The kind I described earlier. This is merely an example of a data point I was collecting in my brain. There are many, many others, but all of it taken together made it clear to me, and I still believe this, that it is indeed very difficult, but possible, to negotiate long-lasting peace with Vladimir Putin. It is certainly true that Ukraine is best positioned to negotiate from a place of strength. After the invasion of February 24th, 2022, I believe there were 3 chances where peace was most achievable. First chance was March and April of 2022 with a successful defense of the North. Second chance was the fall.
Okay, but when we say that, at what point did the Russians' demands back off of demilitarization? Because it is true that there was the Istanbul format, and the Russians always want to restart negotiations based off the Istanbul format because they want Ukraine to demilitarize, so it'd be easier to invade them next time, and so that they would pose less resistance diplomatically, because the less hard power you have in real life, you do reflect that in your diplomatic engagement with states that are more powerful than you. And so they want that diplomatic weight. They want that ability to use that force against Ukraine with less resistance next time, considering how much of a disaster this was for the Russian armed forces. And these are terms that they were just never going to accept back then, especially if they knew that the West was going to make a good on their commitments to protect them now that the entirety of the existence of their state had been thrown into question. So when we say that that was an opportunity for peace, like under which framework, under which terms, and how do you get over the issue of just kicking the can down the road again? Because he said that there was an opportunity for long-lasting peace. Okay, if you negotiate away Ukraine's armament and then the Russians invade again in a year or two, you didn't achieve peace, did you?
Of 2022, with the successful counteroffensive in Kherson and Kharkiv. The third chance is now.
That I don't know if with the successful counteroffensive in Kherson and Kharkiv, whether that would have been a. There's a chance that it might have been, but it's all just pure speculation. I think it's pure speculation. It is true that the Russians were in a difficult position, but they were also digging in to protect the gains that they made, and they never officially let go of their objectives. And in the time period leading up to those counteroffensives to take back Kherson and such, the Russians were announcing annexations. They were annexing territory left and right. So it wasn't like they ever pulled their foot off the gas. It's just that they were put in a worse position. And what was the peace that could have been negotiated at that point that was long-term? They still didn't want Ukraine to join any big defensive alliance like NATO, or even really any unilateral alliances that I'm aware of. I don't know that they backed off of their Ukraine's demilitarization or not. They still wanted to hold every piece of land they had, and they still were announcing that they wanted to annex the city of Kherson and all this other land. They want the rest of Donetsk. They want the rest of Luhansk. And they've never backed off the idea that they had to give those up to negotiate as a precondition to negotiation. That was a demand they continued to make. As a precondition to negotiation, the land that they have announced annex, including much of the land that they currently don't even hold on to, many cities made of hundreds of thousands of people, would have to be given up. And so maybe you could say that's a bluff, and if they would have made an offer that would have just frozen the line without anything solidified on defense arrangements, but that's not long-term sustainable peace. That's possibly just like short-term peace. And that's also assuming that they did, like, is it a possibility? I mean, maybe, but I mean, I think it's still I think it was still unlikely, but maybe it was possible if we're hopeful, but,
As he has stated multiple times publicly, Donald Trump is very interested in making peace. It is likely that the U.S. financial support for this war will continue to dwindle. So, the leverage and the timing for peace negotiation is now. There is unlikely to be another chance like this for a long time.
So he's saying that U.S. support for Ukraine will dwindle along with the leverage. And the logic being, of course, that you want to negotiate now because with time and with Trump's talk of, either cutting aid or making it so the amount of aid is at least lessening from the United States would mean that over time, Ukraine's going to have less and less of a position. Russia's going to demand more and more, and the peace is going to be more painful. Ukraine's going to lose more territory. They're going to lose more negotiations. But the Russians are still demanding demilitarization. They're still demanding the territory that they've announced to annex. They haven't backed off those demands, and those demands are so enormous and so unpalatable to the Ukrainian population that I don't know them to be willing to accept that as a permanent concession for a permanent structure, which is what he asked for, something permanent, not just a temporary ceasefire. He wanted a peace deal, not a ceasefire, which are two different things. There's a difference between the ceasefire along the Korean Peninsula and a long-term peace agreement, which is what he's talking about. Now, if it is true that aid to Ukraine will dwindle from Europe or the United or from wherever, and they're not going to have the munitions to continue fighting, then it is true that a peace deal sooner would be better. But if the conditions are still unacceptable, then the Ukrainian population still might not be willing to accept it, and you don't want a divided home front. It would be very bad if this was the case. Because if the Russians believed it to be the case, then what would motivate them to negotiate in the first place? If they believed the United States was going to send less and less and less aid, then they're going to be maximalist in their demands because they believe the United States is close to quitting. And so my belief is the only real hope for peace is by making it clear that you will not just let aid dwindle if the war continues. And this has been something talked about by some people in the Trump administration. I know Mike Waltz has talked about it. I believe Pete Hegseth might have talked about it at one point, but he's quiet down about it recently. But the idea is that you would threaten Trump with increased aid to Ukraine. I mean, you would threaten Putin with increased aid to Ukraine to get him to the table and get him to accept terms. But if you're not willing to pull the trigger on that, then you're bluffing. And if you're bluffing there, you could be bluffing elsewhere, and you don't want to reduce the credibility of the United States. But also, if they do call bluff and you just don't pull trigger and they bowl over Ukraine, it's going to be a disaster for European defense. It's going to be a disaster for the United States credibility. And I mean, a lot of people, including the former Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, talk about the downstream effects for deterrence on nation states like Taiwan. And that's still up in the air. And a lot of that is theoretical. And different defense theorists and IR theorists disagree exactly how much impact it would have. But if the United States' willpower to support Ukraine up to this point ends due to just domestic political partisanship politicizing the issue and making it toxic, then why would the Chinese think they couldn't extend that logic to Taiwan? So, concerns.
Just to zoom out on the conversation piece of this, I interviewed Donald Trump and may do so again. I interviewed Volodymyr Zelensky and may do so again. And it seems likely that I will interview Vladimir Putin in Russia, in the Kremlin. I understand the risks and I accept them. The risks for me are not important. I'm not important. I merely want to do my small part in pushing for peace in a moment in history when there's a real chance for that peace to actually be achieved. I may be speaking too long, I'm sorry, but I can probably speak for many more hours, so this is in fact me trying to be brief. So again, my two goals were to bring out the best in President Zelensky as a leader and a human being, and to give him every opportunity possible to signal that he is ready to make peace, and to lay out his vision for what that peace might look like. Like I said, step 1 through 10 is prepare well. I did. But step 11 is the actual conversation. There, the specific psychological and personality quirks and qualities of the guest matter a lot. My job is to try to cut through the bullshit walls we put up as human beings and reveal, directly or indirectly, who the person truly is and how they think. With Zelensky, he is a deeply empathic and emotional human being who personally feels the suffering of the people of Ukraine in this war. This is a strength and perhaps also a weakness, but it is an important part of the reason why I said many times that he is a truly historic figure. Very few leaders in recent history would be able to pull off what he did, to stay in Kiev, to unite the country, to convince the West to join the war effort to the degree they did. He is also a showman, to borrow the title of the biography I recommended. A man with many layers of humor and wit, but also ego and temper. Sometimes fully self-aware, and sometimes losing himself in the emotional roller coaster of a painful memory or a turn of phrase that he can use as a springboard for an angry soliloquy. Add to this the fact that we didn't agree to anything, what we will talk about, or...
Can I also throw out there, just a little bit, that having a guest get angry emotionally or express that through soliloquy, I think that's good. I think to express that anger, the anger about losing one's home, the anger about losing one's family, the anger of the injustice forced upon the Ukrainian people, the injustice of occupation, the injustice of the lack of civil society that remains in occupied territory, the injustice of having your churches shut down. Like, yeah, that's going to produce an angry response. It's going to produce an emotional response. If there's anything to produce a soliloquy about or to be emotional about, or add in flowery language, it is for injustices like this. And when you're talking to an audience who might have never listened for Zelensky for 3.5 hours, or never listened to him in a long-form conversation, maybe you listened to him from 5 to 10 minutes on CNN. Maybe you saw some people clap for him at the Capitol once. Maybe you heard a quote through a news organization, but have you ever sat down and listened to his, or more importantly, his country story? So yeah, he's gonna throw out the emotional, so that he wants people to feel his country's pain so they can understand why he believes it's important to continue to support them. He's coming on to be interviewed on your show, not only to be a guest. He's not here because he's like, oh, I love the Lex Fridman podcast. I got all your merch, my guy. I wear a black suit and avoid just like you do. No, he's coming on because he wants to get a message out. And then, and he's somebody with so much experience in the media, certainly knew what he was doing going into this. He was the president on TV before he was the president in real life. So it probably wanted to focus on communicating the message, not appealing to Vladimir or setting terms.
How long we will talk about it. The interview could have easily been 5 minutes or 3 hours. So I had to quickly gain his trust enough to open up and stay for a long-form conversation, but push him enough to reveal the complexities of his thought process and his situation. This is where humor and camaraderie was essential, and I would return to it often, though it was very difficult given the stakes, the heaviness, the seriousness of the topic of the war. So in this case, the approach I followed for this conversation is constant nudges and questions about peace, often using almost childlike statements or questions.
Yeah, can you forgive him? Was a little bit.
I generally like these kinds of questions. On the surface, they may seem naive, but they're not. They are often profound in their simplicity, like a lot of questions that children ask. Remember, it was a child who pointed out that the emperor was not wearing any clothes. I like the simplicity, the purity, the boldness of such questions.
Yeah, in a tale, in a fable.
To cut through the bullshit to the truth. And that truth is that hundreds of thousands of people died in this war and are dying every day. And all the other problems.
Patches has donated $20. My problem with Lex is his middle ground towards peace favors Putin. He either lives in a world with TF2 pyro goggles, or he is a moron, or he is a snake oil.
I think he's got a bit of the pyro goggles, man. And I'm saying that almost as an envious thing, by the way. It's not even like an insult. Thank you for the $20, by the way. I wish I could live in the country where I believe at the end of the day, Putin loves his country and is making the decisions best for his country. He loves Russia, but that doesn't mean he loves his country. He loves Russia. Russia in his head. He loves Russia, the idea. He loves the empire. He loves the double-headed eagles. He loves the parades. He loves the conquest. He loves remaking the lines of the Ruski Mir and bringing back together the people of the Russian-speaking world, and making sure that we can reunite the Slavic people. That's the type of, the conservative image of that we don't have queers, and that's the type of, he loves his image of Russia. He loves that Russia. He doesn't love necessarily what you would actually see if you walk the streets of Murmansk, or, some of the communities that might not be picture perfect for this image of Russian Empire. And when that framework of Lex's was challenged, and I accept the idea that sometimes questions can sound silly but are profound, childish but are profound, because there's innocence in them. You want to get to pure. You want to get to you want to get the something more profound. You want to get to something deeper. You want to get to something where they're thinking about something just like very basically human, a basic emotion. But when you're talking about a war with the leader of the country getting invaded, and they reframe it after you throw that because they reject the naivete of the question, or they reframe it, and then you bring it back to that same question and reject the reframing and reject the way that they took the childlike question and gave it a serious response, then I kind of don't understand the purpose of it.
From corruption to suspended elections to censorship cannot be solved until peace is made. I give the president every single chance to signal willingness to negotiate, knowing that both.
By the way, corruption can be addressed while the war is going on, and saying that it can't gives a cover to the government for allowing certain instances or looking past certain instances. In fact, you would say in a death struggle for survival, you would have possibly the political capital and movability and flexibility to crack down on corruption more, because you would have more possible war powers. And you would have more of the mandate of the people to say, do what's necessary to survive, cut off the rot of the state, you know? So I don't agree that you can't address corruption until the war is dealt with at all. In fact, I think in order to fight a war, you're going to have to deal with corruption.
Every single chance to signal willingness to negotiate, knowing that both Trump and Putin will listen to this conversation. I don't think he took it, and instead chose to speak very crude words towards Vladimir Putin. This is fully understandable, but not directly productive to negotiation. To clarify,
podcast was not going to be directly productive to negotiation. Zelensky didn't sign up to this podcast thinking that this was going to be a letter to Putin about what he would be willing to do to find peace and how he's going to concede this way, concede that way. Their terms are the same terms that they have been for a while, from the Russians and from the Ukrainian perspective, right? What they both want to change is leverage, either by getting long-term commitments from the United States or undermining long-term commitments to the United States. Either by getting the Europeans to step up or getting the Europeans to step down and accept back in Russian gas, remove, say, whatever it is. And when they do sit down and talk, because there will, even if there was a complete Russian withdrawal, there would have to be some sit down to negotiate withdrawal. When the Confederacy lost, they had to, they had to surrender. Lee had to hand over the sword. And there was at the end of the day, you want Ukraine to have the most leverage possible. I don't understand how Zelensky, looking at this podcast, sees it right now in this period of transition as the best time to start showing his hands about what he's actually be willing to give up, both to Trump and the Americans, and whether it has to be with, for example, his offer of replacing American soldiers with Ukrainian soldiers and bases across Europe to help them deal with, manpower constraints. But whatever that negotiation, why he would show his hand on this show, when for him the purpose of going on this show was to get his message out to the people, because he believes that a lot of Americans aren't hearing the Ukrainian story. And from the Lex Fridman comment section, I would believe that to be the case. So he went there with a different objective. He's not going to make peace on this podcast. You can ask him questions about peace and what would be something that would be feasible, and staying in that area, I think, is the most productive. To try to get his perspective on what would be feasible for his people, what he would like, what would be necessary, what his people would accept, not just what he would accept, but what his people would accept. Staying in that area is useful, but just asking him to okay, compromise a little bit more. Okay, find a middle ground. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to go anywhere. You can't just tell him to manifest the middle ground on your podcast in the middle of negotiation where millions of lives are on the line. Billions, if you believe the escalation. Well, billions, period, anytime any nation state with atomic weapons are facing down.
I have hosted many...
Not to mention, NATO is an alliance of 1 billion people.
Conversations that were intensely critical of Vladimir Putin, from Serhiy Plokhy to Stephen Kotkin. But this conversation is...
Also, Zelensky being rude doesn't matter. Putin was on his show weeks before fantasizing about using Ukrainian cities as a testing ground. And he has used Ukrainian cities as a testing ground for weapons. And he talks about having competitions with the West to see whose weapons would be better. Oh, it'll be exciting. It's interesting. His propagandists are actively talking about leveling city after city because nobody left in Ukrainian cities are their people. Their people had already all left, so they can level Kharkiv. They can level these cities. They're talking in such disgusting language. When he's doing these press conferences to international press, he has war criminals behind him. He has the people who literally perpetrated Bucha. He's giving them all awards. He's making them hold flags. He's making a point. Either to the Ukrainians or to his own people, to put those people behind him. In so many different media interactions during so many big state events. And he just did it again. With the Bucha people at that big international presser where, the press is supposed to be able to come and ask, quote unquote, tough questions, etc. In a controlled media environment. And Zelensky is supposed to look at that and he's supposed to treat him nice. He's supposed to, and now we're angry that he was rude. It's not going to be rudeness or politeness that decides this war. We're past rudeness or politeness once the mass graves start appearing, aren't we?
Is with a world leader speaking about another world leader during a historic opportunity for peace. Crude words of disrespect, while powerful, may harm negotiations.
But honesty will help people see the situation clearer, and I think possibly help them in leverage, because if people can see the situation clearer, maybe that'll help them. That's his perspective. I don't think the rudeness or non-rudeness in the interview is going to end up mattering really at all in the long term. Whether or not the American people are going to be willing to stick with it, like he just said about leverage and how American aid is leverage, that'll matter.
Agora has donated $5. Hello from a Kramatorsk native.
Hey!
I just wanted to thank you for the good work and support of my country. Do you believe the overall effect of that podcast was positive for Ukraine?
Yes, I do. I said this also on X and Blue Sky. Dylan Burns 1776 on Twitter, Dylan Burns TV on Blue Sky. I do think it's generally positive. I think Zelensky gave a good showing of the country's national story. I think he's a good storyteller. He has a really good, grasp on media. I think he has a general idea of how to talk to Westerners. And, while Lex talked a lot about how, this interview is going to reach Russians and we're going to do it in Russian, and I'm sure it did to some, where's it mainly going to be published? It's going to be published on YouTube. That's where it's mainly going to get its viewership. What's getting throttled in Russia? What's getting banned in Russia? Oh, it's YouTube. So I think Zelensky's goal was to talk to the Western audience. I think he gave up on talking to Russians weeks into the war when his appeals largely fell on deaf ears, and the few people who did protest got arrested and herded off, some of which even into military conscription, wouldn't you know it. And so I think he focused on telling the national story, and I think he succeeded at that. And I think he also succeeded at addressing popular misconceptions, and that he dealt with most of the curveball that Lex Fridman threw at him quite well and came off very well. He came off as very likable and sympathetic, and I think that from the comment section that I was reading, that most of the audience seemed to agree as well. Now, that's not the case universally. You're not going to change everybody's viewpoint overnight, but most people were hearing about Zelensky and Ukraine's narratives through just social media feeds saying that they've taken all their money to buy Zelensky's wife a new yacht and fucking millionaire mansion. Then they start hearing about, the occupation and people being displaced and, Christians being persecuted and their churches being shut down and, the people being killed and the mass graves and oh my gosh, and then the children being kidnapped. And then it's a totally different perspective for them. So I think in that goal, he was much better at. So I would say, generally speaking, it was positive. How much impact overall it's going to have? I mean, I can't tell you that. I can't just analyze the media impact, but I do think it was more positive than negative for any of the silly questions that were asked or any of the bad moments of the podcast, which there were very few of. I mean, there were some silly questions, I would maybe even say naive questions, but not a lot of bad podcast moments. I think it was generally a good interview. I think Lex did generally speaking, a good job.
Peacemaking in this situation requires compromise in order to avoid
towards his first goal that he was aiming at, for sure.
Further death and suffering. And I believe it requires treating the other leader with the seriousness you expect him to treat you with. This is what I was pushing for.
But that's the problem, Lex. Putin doesn't want to treat Zelensky with any seriousness. He hasn't treated them with any seriousness. He doesn't treat them as a sovereign government. He doesn't. He specifically said that as a precondition to negotiations, the Ukrainians cannot be at the table. He doesn't even want to talk to them, let alone look at them with any respect. He just wants to negotiate over their heads with the Americans. So what amount of respect is if he says a nice word, is that going to change that? He doesn't view the Ukrainian nation state as a separate entity from Russia. He sees this as a civilizational struggle between Russia's world and America. And so it's the Americans to talk to. He doesn't respect the Ukrainians. So you're not going to gain respect from the Ukrainians, from the Russians by being nice to them. You can only gain it through having the leverage through physical force and diplomatic weight and economic weight to make them respect you. In the same way the Finns made them respect them, or other countries who have been aggressed upon by the powers in Moscow.
All that while also putting my ego aside and letting the president shine, which is necessary to accomplish both goals 1 and 2 that I mentioned previously. This is also why I wanted the president to speak about Elon and Trump, to extend the olive branch for further avenues of peacemaking. This is not about politics. It is, once again, simply about peace. Now, all of this, my words, my attempts, were taken out of context and used to attack me by some online mobs. As an example, President Zelensky said in a mocking tone that he thinks that Vladimir Putin is simply irritated by people who are alive in Ukraine. And I answered, quote, "If you believe this, it will be very difficult to negotiate. If you think that the president of a country is completely crazy, it is really hard to come to an agreement with him. You have to look at him as a serious person who loves his country and loves the people in his country. And he conducts, yes, destructive military actions." The president interrupted me at this point and said, "Who are you talking about now? Who loves his country?" And I said, "Putin. Do you think he doesn't love his country?" And the president answered, "No." Again, this is not a podcast conversation with a historian or activist, and I somehow, out of nowhere, just for fun, waxed poetic about Putin's or Zelensky's or Trump's love of nation. It is a conversation with a world leader discussing the opportunity to negotiate peace when a large number of people are dying every single day.
Because the Russians don't want peace. I'm sorry, I'm going to be as simple as possible. They don't want peace. If you think they want peace, when you talk about the authorities in Moscow and their backers in the long term, you're fucking naive. And the current mindset is the problem wasn't initiating the war. That was not the decision or the mindset pushed by the authorities. There are people in Russia who believe that, but that is not what's being pushed by the Moscow authorities. There might be problems with how it was managed. There might be problems with how corruption worked, but the decision to go into Ukraine and to fight and kill all these people from their perspective was ultimately the correct one. That it was the right decision to make, that you had to go in and you had to do it eventually, better now than tomorrow, when the Ukrainians would have been even more prepared. That's the perspective. That's their current position on the war. And they believe that this isn't the stop. It's part of an extended civilizational struggle between Russia and the West as it regains its prominence in the world. That's what the current authorities in Moscow believe. Now, maybe the authorities change. Maybe the war ends and all of the sacrifices from the commercial banking sector that has caved itself out, and please mark my words on this, caved itself out in order to support the Russian government. Because that 8% spending on defense, that's not the real number. Okay, I'm gonna shake the boat a little bit and say, well, that's a high number on average. The commercial banking sector has subsidized the government, has backed them up on top of that. And once you have all this military production that isn't keeping the GDP increase alive, go under, you have some problem, government goes down, maybe there will be something different in the future. But for the current authorities in Moscow, they don't believe the decision to invade was a mistake. So they still believe in the war. They still believe in the fight. They still believe in the invasion. They still believe it was the correct decision. And so if they can scrape away something that can be sold either to themselves or to the population, but more importantly to themselves, as a victory, as the right decision to do, as the right thing to do, then they can justify doing it again. They can justify invading again, or they can justify invading a different country again, whether it be Georgia, if the public gets too angry with the Georgian dream and shows them the door, whether it be the coup planning that we saw recently in Armenia that was busted up, according to the Armenian authorities, whether it has to do with Moldova and the very obvious interference that the Russian state has been doing recently, the vote buying that has been alleged, or, for example, another invasion from Transnistria.
Has occurred.
Patches has donated $10. Denibo, make pyro goggles emote. I pay $50 next stream it exists.
Thank you. Thank you, Patches, for the $10. I appreciate it. Look, it's not that I don't think that Putin wouldn't appreciate removing some pressures on his economy in the short term, but like he still has longer term goals to keep this going. And he believes that, you know, these countries are in his sphere of influence and he can dominate them. And so until that essential authority is clearly shaken and he treats the Ukrainians as equals. That's not to say that he caves to every single thing the Ukrainians ever asked, but treats them as negotiated equals and understand that they are not part of their empire until those two things happen, until those acknowledgments are made. Then it's just, I feel like it's going to be a pause, even if, there might be a deviation because the government collapses and there might be a different, but it'll be a pause for the government. From the government's perspective, it'll just be a pause. And a pause is not peace. It is just a temporary cessation of the suffering.
Even if the heart boils over with hate, leadership now requires sitting at the negotiation table and compromising. This may be painful, but it is necessary. There are a few other places in the conversation where some online mobs took my words out of context and used them to call me naive and to call for more war, saying peace is impossible with a man who they claim is the second coming of Hitler. My friends, if you make such attacks on this conversation, it is in fact you who are naive and ignorant of the facts of history and geopolitics. Peace must be made now, in order for death and suffering to stop, in order for Ukraine to have a chance to flourish, and in order for the drums of a global war to stop beating. A global war that would cripple humanity. This was my goal, once again, to push for peace. And I will continue this effort to the best of my ability. Thank you. I love you all.
It's a noble goal, but many presidents and many politicians find that their agenda and what they want to accomplish is restricted by the conditions around them. A president and a leader, a politician, a diplomat, anyone of influence needs to know when to choose the moment. We can all hope this is the moment, but your podcast is not going to manifest it. How's everybody doing tonight? Is this AI generated Lex? No, it is just the Lex.